Okay, so Parsha Illuminated Parshas Vayeishev, and as we were discussing, I put a lot on here, and there's a lot I want to share. So hopefully we'll get through everything, but if we talk about it, then we won't get through anything. Okay, so here we go. So I'm starting actually at the end of the Parsha, and in this week's Parsha, it's a very eventful Parsha. Yosef offends his brothers. They first want to kill him, then they change their mind. They'll throw him in a pit. Then they sell him. He gets sold down to Egypt. He goes through numerous experiences while in Egypt. He ends up at the end of the Parsha in prison. And that's where I want to pick up. And he's imprisoned. He's accused of trying to commit a sin with the wife of his master, Ashes Potiphar. That's how he ends up in prison. And then the Torah says as follows. This is chapter 40, Parak Mem, right at the beginning. It says, and it was after these events, Chatu Mashke Melch Mitzrayim B'Haofeh. The butler, the cupbearer of the king, and the baker sinned against their master, their master, the king of Egypt, to the Pharaoh. What was their sin? So Rashi tells us, I put on the source sheet, Zeh nimtza zivuv b'fayle poshin shalo. So there was a fly found in the cup of the cupbearer that he was serving to Pharaoh, and there was a pebble found in the bread that the baker was serving. So that was their sin against the Pharaoh, and they end up in prison. Now Rashi, I didn't include this, but Rashi mentions that sort of the juxtaposition, the languaging, it was after these events, like right after Yosef ended up in prison. So Rashi says, because everybody in Egypt was talking about what Yosef had done, or what he was accused of doing, and it was in all the tabloids, and this was a distraction from that, and now everybody would be talking about what happened with the butler and the baker of the Pharaoh, how they had served him wine and bread that had visitors inside. Okay, so what happens? So actually, it still continues to sum up. It says, "Vayisof Paro shnei sarisav." So Pharaoh became incensed, and then verse 3, and he placed them in the prison, which is where Yosef was, where Joseph was. Verse 5, Vayachamu chalom shnehem, and both of them dreamt a dream, ish chalomo, each one his dream, b'layla echad, on one night, ish kifisron chalomo, and each man according to the interpretation of his dream, hamashke v'haofeh, the butler and the baker, asher l'melch Mitzrayim, of the king of Mitzrayim, asher asurim b'beis hasoher, who were imprisoned in prison. It's a very strange verse. It reads almost like it's backwards. If you would read it backwards to forwards, it might even read better. Just to read it again. And they dreamt a dream, the two men, his dream in one night, each man the interpretation of his dream, the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt that were imprisoned in the prison. Okay, so Rashi says, first of all, that when it says that they dreamt, they both dreamt a dream. That's the simple reading, is they both had a dream. That's the simple reading. However, the Midrash says that, no, they each dreamt two dreams. They each dreamt the dream of the other also. They both dreamt the dream of the two of them. So they both had two dreams. And as Rashi says, it's also on the source sheet, its midrashic meaning is that both dreams, meaning that each dreamed his own dream and the interpretation of his companion's dream. And that's what it would mean, each man according to the interpretation of his dream, is that they also dreamt the interpretation of the other ones. And then later, when it says that the baker, we'll point this out when we get to that verse again, that the baker saw that Joseph had given a good interpretation, was because he knew the interpretation, because he had dreamt the interpretation and therefore asked to have his interpreted as well. So interesting midrash. Again, it's a very strange read in the pasuk, in the verse, and that's maybe why the sages are reading this in. That not only did they dream their own dream, but they dreamt the interpretation of each other's dream. Now, for some reason, neither of them offered the interpretation to the other one, which is maybe a question that we can leave hanging out there. Why not? It could be that neither of them knew that the other one had a dream, as we'll see. We'll have to see if that fits into the reading of the subsequent verses. So the next verse says, in verse 6, Vayavo alehem Yosef baboker, and Yosef came to them in the morning, Vayaro sam, and he saw them binam zoafim, and they were troubled. So he first of all he saw them, and he noticed that they were troubled. It could be they didn't even notice that each other, that each one was having a problem. But Yosef noticed that they were both looking somewhat sad or just troubled. So he asked them, he asked them, these people who were in prison with him, getting a little bit of extra words, like we know they're there, but maybe we can say that it's that even though Yosef was also a prisoner, but yet he still noticed when others were down. And he asked them, Madua pnechem ra'im hayom, why are you looking upset today? And again, this speaks to Yosef's sensitivity, his care, that he noticed something. First of all, he noticed something was wrong, and he asked them and wanted to truly find out what was troubling them. The Be'er Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Salant, has a fascinating idea on this verse. He says that the word hayom seems extra here. Why are your faces sad today? Like, okay, you could say, as opposed to yesterday, they weren't sad, but just say, why are your faces sad? What is hayom? What is that adding today? So he suggests that Yosef was saying, today of all days you shouldn't be sad. Why? What was special about that day? So we know Yosef is going to interpret the dreams, and then it's going to take him a while before he actually gets out of prison. The beginning of next week's Parsha, Miketz, it begins, and it was at the end of 2 years. So it's going to be 2 years before he gets out of prison. Now, the sages teach us, the Gemara says, that Yosef was freed from prison on Rosh Hashanah. He was freed from prison on Rosh Hashanah. Now, if we assume that when it says it was after 2 years, that the whole episode happens that he's freed, so if we assume that it's 2 years to the day, that means that today is also Rosh Hashanah. That on Rosh Hashanah, he came and he saw them sad. So Yosef says the Be'er Yosef, that's specifically why Yosef said, why are you sad today? You shouldn't be sad on Rosh Hashanah. We know that on Rosh Hashanah, of all days, we do special simanim, right? We do special signs, symbols, that there's an impact on what we do on Rosh Hashanah, how it affects the rest of the year. And he says that in the Svarim, in the books, it says that a person has to be careful not to get angry on Rosh Hashanah. They should be happy and confident, as a good sign for a good year. That the way, not only is there symbolism in what we eat or what we look at or what we say a blessing over, but there's symbolism in the way that we act on Rosh Hashanah. And in fact, he quotes from the Maisa Rav, which is stories about the Vilna Gaon, not stories, but like the conduct of the Vilna Gaon, Rebbe Eliyahu of Vilna. Like he says, one shouldn't cry on Rosh Hashanah. So the way that we act on Rosh Hashanah impacts the rest of the year. So specifically, okay, they weren't like observing Rosh Hashanah, but Yosef recognized this was an important day that God looks at the world and can impact everyone's future. And so when he said, why are you sad today, Hayom? So he meant specifically because it's Rosh Hashanah, especially you shouldn't be sad. Okay, so that's a very big chiddush, a novel idea from the Be'er Yosef. Continuing on, so again, Yosef notices they're sad. He's very sensitive to that, and he asks them what's wrong. And they respond verse 8, and they said to him, we have dreamed a dream, and there is no interpreter for it. Yosef said to them, Halo le'elokim pisronim. Don't interpretations belong to God? Tell them to me, and I will see if I can help you. Okay, and then they begin to tell over their dreams. There's a lot of discussion about the dreams, what they symbolize, like the deeper symbolism of them. We're not going to go there today. So for now, actually, I want to just quickly summarize the dream. So the cupbearer says, in my dream, there was a vine, and there were 3 tendrils, and it was blossoming, and produced grapes. And then he says, and Pharaoh's cup is in my hand, and I took the grapes. And so basically there's this vine, he has 3 tendrils, and he takes the grapes and he squeezes them into the cup, and he serves the cup to Pharaoh, to Paro. And Yosef said, this is its meaning. The 3 tendrils are 3 days, and another 3 days Pharaoh will number you, meaning he'll count you out, and he'll restore you to your position, and you will again place Pharaoh's cup into his hand, as you did in the past, according to your previous custom, when you were his cup bearer. So that's the interpretation that he offers to the butler. Again, the butler in his dream, grapes grow, he serves them to Paro. Yosef says, that's a good sign for you. You're going to be, in 3 days, you're going to be returned to your position as the cup bearer. But then he throws in another line, and this is verse 14. He says, Ki im zechartani itcha, but remember me when things go well for you. Kasher yitav lach, just as I have done good for you. Vasisam na imadi chesed, do me a favor. V'yizkartani el Paro, mention me to Paro. V'otzesani mi v'ayzezeh, and you will get me out of this house, out of this prison. So he throws in at the end, Ki im zechartani itcha, but remember me. It's a strange way to say it. To start the sentence, Ki im zechartani, but, or Ki im kind of means only that you should remember me. Maybe that's a better interpretation. Only that you should remember me with you. What does he mean by that? Only that he should remember me with you. So I saw Rabbi Fran on the Parsha in his second book. I don't know if this is his own answer or if he quoted it from somewhere else, but he says that what Yosef was saying is that this may sound completely unsensible to you, Mr. Butler, Mr. Cupbearer. There was no logical way to explain why he would be reinstated. If they're in prison now to be killed because they're accused of doing something wrong, and in those days and in such a society, there's really no chance to be let out and certainly not reinstated to his position. So for Pharaoh to reinstate him would say really he didn't do anything wrong in the first place, and that wasn't something that was going to happen. So Yosef says that you are going to be reinstated, ki im zechartani itcha, only so that you should remember me, just as I did good for you, and you'll get me out of this prison. In other words, Yosef is explaining that really this is all about, not in an arrogant way, but this is about me. That I understand that if you are to be returned to your position in such a miraculous, unpredictable way, then it's ki im zechartani itcha. It's only in that so that you should remember me and be able to get me out. Because Yosef recognized that he was on, I suppose you'd say he recognized he was on a path that was being orchestrated by God to maybe in the back of his mind he has his dreams in mind. Yosef, right at the beginning of the Parsha, has dreams that he will eventually be a king of some sort, a leader of some sort, and he recognizes this, and that's why he says, it's only that you should remember me. Now, I think we can add to this that if we assume like Rabbi Frand is suggesting, that this is like utterly impossible, that this butler would be reinstated to his position, then maybe it helps us understand just a little bit of a like strange, unnecessary wording in a couple of the verses here. So in verse 13, in Yud Gimel, so the way that Yosef tells him it's going to happen is, Ba'od shloshes yamim yisa Pharaoh es roshecha. In another 3 days, Pharaoh will raise your head. What does that mean, he'll raise your head? So it's actually interesting because he also tells the baker, Pharaoh is going to raise your head, except for he says he's going to raise your head me'alecha, from upon you, meaning he's going to take off your head. That was the interpretation for the baker who was going to be killed. For the butler, it's Pharaoh will raise your head. What does that mean? Rashi says, Lashon cheshbon. It's a language of counting, numbering. When he counts, says Rashi, when he counts the rest of his servants to serve him at the feast, he will count you along with them. Now, like, what does that mean? Why is that important? Why doesn't he just say he'll reinstate you? What does it mean that when he counts everybody else, he's going to count you along with them? It sounds to me like Rashi is saying that it's going to be accidental. He's going to reinstate you by accident. He's going to be listing off, his servants to who should come before him. And even though much time has elapsed since it's a year, the commentaries say that between when this butler comes to prison and when he has his dream and is freed, but still Pharaoh's going to like either accidentally mention him or he's reading off a list and his name is on the list. But it seems like it's completely by accident that he ends up being reinstated. And that's actually what happens, again, when it says later how he is reinstated. If you look in verse 20, it says, now it came about on the 3rd day, Pharaoh's birthday, that Pharaoh made a feast for all his servants, and he counted the chief cupbearer and chief baker among his servants. He just listed them off. He just mentioned them. And Rashi, again, he counted them. He counted them with the rest of his servants, for he was counting the servants who would serve him in his feast. And he remembered these among them. Like he mentioned them among them. And now he had to explain why he was calling them forth. So one of them, he still decided that the butler would be reinstated and that the other one would be killed. But it's like almost sounds like it wasn't on purpose that he called them out, and that freed them. And once they were freed, so one of them he determined should be killed, and one of them he determined should be reinstated. Otherwise, why else is he calling them out? So that seems to be, again, part of the hashgacha, part of God engineering these events to get Yosef out, is that it's completely out of the question that this butler would be freed and returned to his position. It only came about really by accident that Pharaoh called him forth, and that was God engineering events to be able to free Yosef or eventually have Yosef interpret Pharaoh's dream at the beginning of next week's Parsha, and that will be the rise to power of Yosef. Okay, now one other thing that I want to point out along those lines is that, so let's go back and get back on track. Let's go back to verse 15. So Yosef continues. He says, okay, let's go to 16. So after Yosef interprets the dream of the butler, so the verse says, Vayar sar ha'ofim ki tov pasar. Now the chief baker saw that he interpreted well, and he said, Afani b'chalami, I also had a dream, and I was holding 3 baskets on my head, and I left it out, but then birds came and ate from the baskets. And Yosef tells them, okay, your dream is that in 3 days you're going to be killed. Okay, but I want to focus on these words. And he saw, Vayar sar ofim ki tov pasar. And the baker saw that Yosef had interpreted well. What does that mean? He liked Yosef's interpretation. He thought it was a good idea. So it could be he saw that Yosef was on the ball. He saw Yosef had a good interpretation that made sense, and therefore he asked him. We already mentioned earlier, Rashi already alluded to it earlier, back in verse 5, when Rashi said that each one dreamt the other one's interpretation. So Rashi said, and that's what this means. And he saw that Yosef interpreted well because he already had dreamt the interpretation of the other one's dream. So the baker saw that Yosef gave a good interpretation because he himself dreamt that interpretation and knew that it was a good interpretation, and therefore he went and turned to Yosef to interpret his as well. Other commentaries say something else. The Radak and the Paneach Raza, they say that, well, actually, first of all, Paneach Raza says something interesting. He says that he saw that Yosef was interpreting truth, or at least what he felt was truth, because Yosef gave an interpretation that would come about only 3 days from now. He says, now, if a person is trying to make something up, they're not going to say that it's going to happen in a day or in 2 days or in 3 days or even a week. They're going to say something that, like, way down the road in the future, one day you're going to be whatever. But to say something that is going to be tested right away, so you have to be, you have to know what you're talking about to be able to make such a suggestion. Otherwise, it's going to be proven wrong within 3 days. So that's what he liked about Yosef's interpretation. He thought it was true because it was said in a way that will be proven within 3 days. Yeah, Robert.
I just had another thought in Bracha that talks about interpretation of dreams and says that the interpretation goes according, the meaning of the dream goes according to how it's interpreted. So maybe he said, Yosef is interpreting this dream as a good sign, so he'll interpret my dream to mean something good also.
Beautiful. Okay, excellent. So that's what actually I was about to say before I jumped in with the Paneach Raza. So both the Radak and the Paneach Raza also say that. They quote exactly the Gemara that you're saying. It's in Brachos, Daf Nun Hey, Hachalomos holchem acher hapeh, that dreams follow the interpretation, and based on a person's interpretation, they will play out. Okay, now dreams is a whole topic in itself, but that's what they say. They say since the baker saw that Yosef gave a good interpretation, and the interpretation of dreams impacts what they actually will come to mean, the way they're interpreted itself is what the dream will end up meaning. So therefore he wanted Yosef to interpret his as well. Unfortunately, Yosef did not interpret his for good, but rather interpreted that he would be killed within 3 days, which is what happened. But I just had a thought about this whole thing, which is that whichever one of these answers we go with, actually not whichever one, but let's say certainly according to this last interpretation, that he saw that Yosef had given a good interpretation. That's why he wanted his dream interpreted as well. So if we understand that way, then the pasuk might be telling us something even more important, which is that the order of events that played out was not random. Because if Yosef had interpreted the baker's dream first and said, well, your dream means that in 3 days you're going to be killed, then we wouldn't have this pasuk. We wouldn't have this verse that says, and the butler saw that Yosef gave a good interpretation and said, oh, me too, interpret mine as well. And he would have said, oh, this guy interprets dreams badly, I'm not having him interpret my dream. And he would have gone back to sleep, right? So, and then Yosef would have never interpreted the butler's dream, and the butler would still have gotten out of jail 3 days later, but would never have had this exchange with Yosef that he would later say, oh, Yosef is the one who interpreted my dream, because he never did. So according to this, the Torah could be telling us that the order of events here was important and not random. And again, hashgacha was God guiding events in having the butler's dream interpreted first, because if the baker's dream had been interpreted first, then the butler would have never asked for his to be interpreted. Okay. Now just to finish up the story, it says, okay, so he was reinstated. We saw that. And in verse 21, Vayeishev sar hamashkim al mashkeu. So the cupbearer was put back in his position as cupbearer, and he placed the cup on Pharaoh's palm. And the chief baker was hanged, as Yosef had interpreted to them. But the chief cupbearer did not remember Yosef, and he forgot him. A lot of discussion about that. What's the two languages? He didn't remember him, and he forgot him. And then questions of whether Yosef was lacking in his bitachon, in his trust in God by relying on this baker or not. Different commentaries have different ideas about that. I want to leave that for now because I want to share two other ideas. So the first is a very novel reading of this whole event that is found in the Haggadah of Rabbi Yechiel Michal Epstein, who's the author of the Aruch HaShulchan, which is a very prominent work on halacha, and he has a Haggadah. It's called Leil Shimurim. Now, in the Haggadah, he's talking about Manishtana, and he's coming to answer. He's asking. His question is in Manishtana. When we ask why is this night different than all other nights, we don't ask about the 4 cups. We don't say why on this night do we drink 4 cups of wine, but on other nights we don't. We don't have that. It doesn't make it into the Manishtana. And the question that many commentaries ask is why is that not included? So it's in trying to answer that question that he builds up the following. So why is he even talking about this? So we should know that before we even talk about his approach, that the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, I have some things out of order here, actually. If you go to the last page, page 3, the second to last source, Talmud Yerushalmi, Jerusalem Talmud Pesachim, it says, Minayin la'arba kosos. What's the idea behind having 4 cups of wine? So the most famous is the first idea that the Yerushalmi says, is that it corresponds, the 4 cups correspond to 4 languages of redemption found in the beginning of Parshas Va'era, that Moshe tells the Jewish people, 4 languages, V'hotzesi, v'tzalti, v'ga'alti, v'lakachti, I'll take you out, and I'll save you, and I'll redeem you, and I'll take you. So that's the 4 cups corresponding to those 4 languages. That's the most famous. However, the Yerushalmi goes on, and it says, Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi said that it's corresponding to the 4 cups of Pharaoh. What 4 cups of Pharaoh? Did Pharaoh have a Seder? He had 4 cups. So, nope, it's talking about the 4 times that it mentions the word kos Pharaoh, the cup of Pharaoh, in the interpretation, in the dream of the butler and Yosef's interpretation. So if we go, it just quotes it there. It says, and Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and I placed the cup on Pharaoh's palm. That's all spoken out by the butler. And then when Yosef interprets it, he says, and you will place Pharaoh's cup into his hand. So 4 times it mentions the cup of Pharaoh. So as corresponding to that, we have 4 cups of wine at the Seder. And of course, the question is, what does that have to do with anything? Why would we have 4 cups of wine at the Seder corresponding to the 4 times that the cup of Pharaoh is mentioned in the dream and interpretation of the butler? So again, there's different answers offered to this question. Here, this is the approach of the author of the Aruch HaShulchan in his Haggadah Leil Shimurim. He says, I don't understand the judgment that was passed against the butler and the baker. Now, usually we assume, well, the butler served a cup of wine that had a fly in it, and the baker served bread that had a pebble in it. Well, the butler was saved. This is what most commentaries say. The butler was acquitted because it wasn't his fault that there was a fly in the wine. The fly flew in. What was he supposed to do? it's not his fault. While the butler, he's got to be more careful. Pebbles don't fly, and it didn't get into the bread by itself, and he must have, whatever, not checked the table before he rolled out the dough or whatever it was. So it's his fault. So that's why he got killed. That's what we usually assume. The Lil Shimurim says, I don't understand that ruling. It should be the opposite. He says the sin of the butler was much worse. The butler placed a cup in Paro's hand. He gave it directly to Paro, and it was a cup that had a fly in it. The baker puts the bread on the table. He doesn't serve it directly into the hand of the king. It just goes on the table. It's for everyone. And yes, maybe Paro ended up with some of it, but he didn't serve it directly to Paro. That can't be worse than what the butler did by serving directly to Paro a cup of wine that had a fly in it. He says, furthermore, what are the chances that both of these occurrences would happen at the same time? It seems that they both got imprisoned around the same time. That's, if you read the verses, it says, that's how the chapter starts. It was after that time, chatu, they both sinned right around the same time. What are the chances, he says? Now, you could say, well, this is, again, it's Hashem, it's God just engineering events to get Yosef out of prison. Okay, that's a possible answer, but how would such a thing play out? It's just so random. Number 3, he says, is it so bad what they did? It was a mistake. It was a mistake. It's one thing Paro would fire them. There was a fly in my cup, you're fired. But to put him in prison and to put him on death row because of that, it seems a little bit. It was a mistake. It wasn't his fault. It was negligence. But to be killed for that seems a little bit over the top. And finally, the Torah says chatu, the first verse in the chapter, chatu, which means they sinned against Paro. Would you call that sinning because they didn't pay so much attention? They made a mistake. It's a little bit of a strong language to say that they sinned against Paro by just neglecting and not realizing that there was a pebble or a fly in the food that they were serving. So he says. So again, he has 4 questions. Number 1, it seems that it should be the opposite. That the cupbearer should be the one who was killed. He served, if anything, it seems what he did was worse. He served this directly to Paro, while the baker just baked the bread and either he put it on the table or someone else, but it wasn't served directly to Paro. That's question number 1. Number 2 is, what are the chances? How did this happen that they both did this the same time? Is there any connection between that? Number 3, such a harsh punishment for a mistake that they get imprisoned and put on death row. And number 4, the Torah even says chatu, they sinned against Paro. Why would we call this that they sinned against Paro if they just made a mistake? Says the Leil Shimurim, libi omerli, my heart suggests to me that there's something much more sinister going on over here. And that is that these two, the baker and the butler, they hated each other. They had it out for each other. And they hated each other so much, they each wanted to bring the other one down. And the butler took a pebble and slipped it into the dough of the baker. And the baker took a fly and slipped it into the wine of the butler. They were both out to get each other. I don't know, maybe they were at the same time. They each went and planted this item in the other one's food that they were to serve. And I guess they were discovered. So really they did something really bad. They did sin against Paro, because they each planted food, not food, but planted something in the food of Paro. Now the baker planted a fly in the cup that was going to be served directly to Paro. That's really, really bad. The butler planted a pebble in a loaf of bread that would be put on the table, which Paro might never eat from. But either he did or they discovered it. So it's bad, but it's not as bad. And that's why the baker gets the worst punishment, because he planted something in the cup that was being served directly to Paro, and the butler, he ends up being reinstated. What he did wasn't as bad, although it wasn't good. It wasn't too nice either. But that also explains the harsh punishment, because they really did do something. It wasn't just a lack of attention. It wasn't just negligence. It was something that they each deliberately did. So that explains what happened between them. Now, what does this have to do with the Seder and with the 4 cups? So he suggests that we know that much of our suffering is as a result of sinas chinam, of hate between Jews. We went down to Egypt because of the fighting between the brothers. That's how we ended up there. Certainly the second temple, the Gemara says, was destroyed because of sinas chinam, of baseless hatred. He says that there's a Gemara that implies that the first temple was also destroyed because of that. So we've gone into exile numerous times over baseless hatred. And he says that's what's being hinted here when Yosef is in prison, that just like the sinas chinam, the hatred, the baseless hatred between the butler and the baker caused them to go into exile, so to speak, caused them to be imprisoned, so too there will be 4 exiles that we later go into, because that's an idea that there's 4 exiles, and there's 4 mentions of the cup. Each one is really a cup of redemption from the exile, but the exile occurs because of baseless hatred, just as the baker and the butler went into exile, went into prison because of baseless hatred. So too Yosef is taught, is shown that his descendants will also and will eventually drink a cup of redemption. A kos Yeshuos will drink a cup of redemption. There will be a redemption, but the cause is baseless hatred. And therefore he says that's why we don't want to mention Iman Ishtan at the beginning. It's not so honorable. It's not such a good thing, the 4 cups. We don't want to necessarily, we drink them, but we don't bring it up in Manishtana, because it actually alludes to not just redemption. It does allude to the redemption, the 4 languages of redemption and the 4 exiles, but it also alludes to the baseless hatred that would send us into exile, and therefore we don't mention it. But just sharing this here, it's just a very fascinating reinterpretation of the story between the butler and the baker, and this hint to how they ended up in exile because of baseless hatred, and that's what leads the Jews into exile, time after time. Okay, we have a couple minutes left, and I want to share something that's related to Hanukkah. Since we're not going to meet next week, we will meet on Hanukkah, hope God willing, the second to last day of Hanukkah, I guess, when the Wednesday, January 1st. I'll be around at least. But we should still have a little thought about Hanukkah before. So if you open back to your source sheet, at the very bottom of page 2, there's a Gemara. The Gemara says, Amar Rav Kahana. Rav Kahana says, Darash Rav Nasan bar Menyomi Mishmeid Rabbi Tanchum. It was taught in the name of Rabbi Tanchum, Ner shel Chanukah sheinicho lamala me'asr mama. If a Hanukkah candle is placed higher than 20 amos, 20 cubits high, about 30 to 40 feet high, Pisula, it's pasul, it's no good. Just like by a sukkah and a mavoi, certain halachos that you can't have something too high. So it's considered like out of a person's line of vision then, and you can't have your Hanukkah lights more than 20 cubits high. That's the halacha, that's how we paskin, that's how we rule. And then the Gemara says another thing. It's the same author, and often the Gemara will bring two, once it quotes one thing from someone, it'll bring another thing, even if it's not related. But it goes on and it says, and Rav Kahana said, in the name of Rav Nasan bar Menyomi, in the name of Rav Tanchum. What does it mean in the verse, also in this week's Parsha? It says, V'habor reik ein bo mayim. when they threw Yosef into the pit, when the brothers threw Yosef into the pit, it says, and the pit was empty, it had no water. So ask the Gemara, once it says that it's empty, don't I know that there's no water? It said it was empty. So what's it coming to teach me? It's telling me ein bo mayim, it didn't have water. Mayim ein bo aval nechashim v'akravim yesh bo. It didn't have water, but it had snakes and scorpions in it. So it wasn't completely empty. It had snakes and scorpions. And this is Rashi in our Parsha quotes this Gemara. And so when they threw Yosef in the pit, there were snakes and scorpions. So many commentaries wonder if there's any connection between these two statements. Like I said, it's common for the Gemara to bring, once it's quoting the teachings of one of the sages, to just quote another statement of his, even if it's not related. But there's a lot of ink spilled trying to connect these two statements. So the one statement is that you can't have your Hanukkah candle higher than 20 cubits high. And the second statement is that when they threw Yosef in the pit didn't have any water in it, but it had snakes and scorpions. So is there any connection between those two ideas? So this year I came across a new idea in the Sefer Apirion, which is a work on Chumash written by Rav Shlomo Gansfri. Rav Shlomo Gansfri is the author of the Kitzer Shulchan Aruch, the shortened Shulchan Aruch, Book of Law, and he suggests the following. In order to answer this, he poses another question, and it's based on another midrash, the following midrash. It's the next source. It's the third to last source, but the last one for us today. It quotes a verse in Shir Hashirim, in the Song of Songs. It says, "Hadudayim nasnu reach, v'al pesachim kol megadim." The mandrakes give a fragrance, and at our gates are all manner of choice fruits, of delicacies, you could say. So it's a verse in Shir Hashirim. Mandrakes give fragrance, some kind of flower, and on our gates are choice fruits. What does this mean? Says this midrash, Hadudayim nasnu reach, the mandrakes gave off fragrance. Zeh Ruvain. That refers to Ruvain. Actually, it's not our last source for today. I have the sources all mixed up. V'al pesachenu megadim, and on our doors, on our gates, on our doorposts are all kinds of delicacies. Zeh ner Chanukah. That's a reference to the light of Chanukah. So again, what is the connection? The mandrakes give a fragrance. That's Ruvain, and on our doorposts, on our gates there's delicacies. That's the Chanukah light. What is the connection between Ruvain and the Chanukah light? Okay, this is what we call a midrash pliya. It's a midrash that's very obscure. It's very unclear what it's supposed to be saying, and that's the fun of it, is trying to explain the connection. So the Apirion's suggestion, or Shlomo Gansfried's suggestion, is as follows. He says, why is it that when it comes to Hanukkah and publicizing the miracle of the menorah, of the lights burning for 8 days, it's done so publicly, specifically for Hanukkah? There's no other miracle that we celebrate, that we publicize in the same manner. Even Purim has a concept, an idea of Persumei Nisa, publicizing the miracle, but it's done in shul. Everybody comes to shul, we read the Megillah. That's the publicizing of the miracle. Pesach, we talk about the miracles at our Seder in our houses, but nothing public like we do for Ner Chanukah, for the Chanukah candles. It can't be too high. It has to be at a time when people are coming and going. Like, there's all these laws that in order to do the mitzvah properly, it has to be done when it's going to publicize the miracle in a public way. And why is that? Why is this miracle different than others? So he suggests that the difference is that miracles that occurred in public in the first place, when we celebrate them, but we don't need to publicize them. They were publicized already. They were in public. They were out in the open. The splitting of the sea, the miracle of Purim, even our salvation. That was all in the public eye. In those, it's something to remember, to give thanks for, but we don't have to publicize it out in public. Specifically, and even in Hanukkah, even the miracle of the war, of our victory over the Greeks, it wasn't in private. It was in public. It maybe takes the right perspective to recognize the miracle of it. It wasn't an open miracle, but it was a public miracle. It happened out in the open, as opposed to the miracle that occurred in the Beis Hamikdash, in the temple, of the candles lasting for 8 nights. Who was there to see it? Certainly not the other nations of the world. Even amongst the Jews, there was a few Kohanim who were there to see it. Nobody witnessed it. Specifically, a miracle, he says, that happened in private, that happened in secret almost. That's where God says that, or that's where, in this case, the rabbis tell us we should publicize it in a public way. A miracle that God did for us in private, we should publicize it in public. And that, he says, is emulating Hashem himself. That's emulating God, because we're supposed to emulate the ways of God, and that's what God did. That's what God does, that when somebody does something great in private, he will publicize it. And as an example, we can turn and look to Ruvain. What's the example when it comes to Ruvain? So when the brothers decide that they're going to kill Yosef, so it says, this is the bottom source. Let's look at verse 21. And Reuven heard, and he saved him from their hands. And he said, let us not deal him a deadly blow. He said, let's not kill him. And then it says, we shouldn't be the ones to kill him, at least you could read it. And then he says, Vayomer Alehem Reuven, don't shed blood. Reuven said to them, don't shed blood. Cast him into this pit, which is in the desert, but do not lay a hand upon him. Why did he do that? In order to save him from their hands, to return him to his father. The Torah says that he did that in order to save them. Now Rashi tells us that it was Ruach HaKodesh, it was the divine spirit that was testifying about Reuven, that he was doing this in order to save him. Why do we need the divine spirit to testify? What do you mean? Of course he was saving him, right? Well, not necessarily, because it could be he just said, we shouldn't kill him. Let's throw him in a pit that's full of snakes and scorpions instead, and they'll get him. And we shouldn't have blood on our hands. How do we know that he was trying to save him? We only know because Ruach HaKodesh, because the Torah tells us that he was trying to save him. We only know because God publicized Reuven's good intentions. Reuven was hoping that even if there are snakes and scorpions in there, but Yosef's merits will allow for him to be saved. The Torah testifies he was doing this in order to be saved. And so he says this is an example where somebody does something great in private, in the recesses of his heart. Only Reuven knew. He didn't tell the brothers he was trying to save him. He just said, we shouldn't kill him. Let's throw him in the pit instead. And the Torah testifies to what Reuven was trying to accomplish. And he says, from there we learn that we should do the same thing. He says that's what the Midrash means. Hadudayim nasnu reach. The mandrakes give a fragrance, meaning that's Reuven. It's the fragrance is something that comes from inside. You don't see it. You smell. You're revealing what's inside. So the Torah revealed. I think, by the way, there's some versions into the Midrash that say that he saved Yosef. It's Reuven who saved Yosef. So the Torah reveals the fragrance inside, what was inside his heart, what he really was trying to do was to save Yosef. And therefore, on our doorposts, we should have delicacies, which the Midrash says means the Hanukkah lights. Because just like Hashem publicized the good that Reuven did in private in the recesses of his heart, so we should publicize that which Hashem did in private for us, that which Hashem made the candles last in private. That's the connection, and that's also explains the connection of the Gemara. The Gemara that starts off and it says you can't put your Hanukkah lights too high because people won't see it and won't publicize the miracle. You can't have them more than 20 amos. Then it says that the pit was empty, but it had snakes and scorpions inside. So what it's telling you is that exactly this point, that you wouldn't have known that Reuven was trying to save Yosef because he had him thrown in a pit with snakes and scorpions. But indeed he was, and that's what the Torah testifies, that Hatzilam Yadam, he was trying to save him. And just as Reuven was trying to, the Torah reveals to us what was in Reuven's heart, and that what Reuven was doing in secret, so to speak, in private, the good that he was trying to accomplish. So we therefore also should reveal to the world the good that God did in the private recesses of the temple, the Beis Hamikdash, in this miracle, and bring it out and publicize it to the world. Okay. So just went a little bit late and we lost a bunch of people along the way, but those who are able to stay longer, do the quick summary. We talked about the story of the butler and the baker and all we pointed out a number of different points about the hashgacha, the guidance, the guiding hand of God in saving, in orchestrating events so that Yosef would eventually get out, by interpreting the dream of the butler. The butler's dream was interpreted first. The butler was randomly mentioned by Paro to be able to, by accident almost, to be able to be freed, something that would never be expected. And Yosef says, Kim Sechartani, the whole idea was in order that you remember me. This is all happening in order that I should be able to get out. We talked about the novel approach of the Aruch HaShulchan, that it was actually a sinister plot of the butler against the baker and the baker against the butler. They each planted their items in the other one's contraband. That's the word I was looking for. They each planted the contraband in the other one's stuff. And finally, this novel approach of the Pirion of Reb Shlomo Gansfried, explaining that we need to publicize the miracle of Hanukkah, the menorah specifically, in a public way, because it was something that God did in private, and this is a way of emulating God's ways to publicize that which he did in private, just as he publicizes, and specifically with Reuven, publicized that which Reuven did in private. Okay.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank
You're
you.
welcome.
And
Ashkar.